So I put up as the title of the talk really a critical analysis and new findings, and I'm going to focus on the critical analysis more than the new findings because I've sent copies of my report, which Vicky might just wave now, to say that it is online and available in hard copy, and it contains many facts. So I want to offer an analysis of theory and research relating to online risk and harm in childhood. And I'm going to draw on the project that we conceive of focused on an account of the opportunities and risks that are afforded to children from using the internet. And we can see some of the debates that position the project, Europe in relation to the rest of the world, children in relation to adults, the online and its relation to the offline. This is, if you like, the kind of a graphic account of the broad domain in which we do our research and which we see as of considerable interest to policymakers. And I want to really start with that concept of evidence-based policy and think about what it is that we think we're doing as researchers, and two of my colleagues, Kjartan Olufsson and Ellen Helsborough, sitting here. What do we think we might be doing as we engage with policymakers, some of whom are sitting here in this audience? So I'll begin with a short reflection. I was very struck a little while ago when reading Sandra Nutley, who wrote a book called Evidence-Based Policymaking, and she maps out 6 possible models of what that relationship might be. One, from the academic's point of view, a push model. We have knowledge, we push it out. One, a pull model. Policymakers need knowledge, they come to us. That's fine, that has had its role in the regulatory environment in relation to children and the internet. 2 extremely problematic models. One, the political model. Let's take the research findings and use them as ammunition in adversarial decision making as we think fit. And for the tactical model, let's see the research findings as a resource when they help us make our decisions and ignore them at other times. And of course, these are the models that make us very wary when we stand in front of policy audiences. And then there's a kind of an ideal model, of which Sandra Nutley has a more minimal and a more maximal version. The minimal version she calls the interactive model, which is that we would have a sustained interaction between research and policy. I take it that's partly what we're doing now. And the other, which she calls the enlightenment model, I don't know if we can ever hope for enlightenment, but that if we really work together and really think very hard and recognise that neither research nor policy is pre-given but can be improved through very constructive engagement, then we might actually understand what's going on. So it's in the spirit of the last 2, somewhere between the minimal and the maximal, but with a weather eye to the dodgy models that I offer my remarks today. And I found this quote which entertained me the other day, if you haven't seen it before. Another warning from a very illustrious academic. So this is where we sit in our research project, with the children who are using the internet at home, at school, elsewhere, ever more of them getting broadband access, mobile access, ever more embedding their everyday activities in relation to their internet activities, filling the timetables and spaces of their daily lives. Accompanying what's a very notable change in children's lives, of course, are both research and policy efforts to chart and respond to the potential that children's use of the internet has for all. So we've got research now that has revealed very considerable opportunities that the internet affords its users, the intriguing digital literacies that children are gaining, and the many benefits of going online. At the same time, we recognise the growing concern that these online opportunities are accompanied by an equally diverse array of risks. Professionals in law enforcement, clinical practice, child protection, as well as the general public, are all calling for action, and to guide this action, they call for research. What these pictures stimulate me to think about is the implicit assumptions that any policy statement makes about the motives, knowledge and practices of children. The different images I might have put up would stimulate different thoughts about what children might need in terms of regulation. If you Google children and the internet, you get an astonishing array of clean, beautiful, happy, white children. So I've used some of my own pictures instead. And the assumptions that we make about how children use the internet might be well judged, they might be very anxious, they might be already out of date. If we think that children are using the internet alone in their bedroom, we'll think of one set of kinds of social support or policy actions. If we see them as strong and able to take whatever life throws at them, we will frame our policies differently from if we see them as vulnerable and in need of different kinds of support. So this is the value of direct research with children. And really, we've just had a rather short number of years in which this research has been going on. So 10 years ago, I reviewed the literature on children and the internet, and I found so little that I very nearly didn't write the review, and I had to make quite a lot of not very much. Now, of course, there is a huge wealth of knowledge, a huge wealth of research, but still some problems. And what we all know we've had to deal with in the last 5 or 10 years is the way in which each new survey, not always very rigorously conducted, generates a kind of a media panic about the latest phenomenon, sometimes with a kind of unspoken competition to come up with the scariest findings, preferably about strangers. We know that researchers have asked all kinds of different questions of children, but they haven't always known exactly what to look for or how to ask children the ethically difficult questions. There's quite a lot of research that is couched in very universalistic terms, though in reality it's been largely American, which raises uncertainties about the relevance of that research in other countries. And, horrifyingly, everything seems to go out of date the minute it's published. So we know a lot about getting a PC in the home. We know a lot about children learning to make web pages with HTML or visiting chat rooms, but who cares? So Barry Wellman said the first age of internet studies was best described as punditry rides rampant. The second age of internet studies, he said, was extremely descriptive. And now we are faced with the challenge of analysis. And that's what I want to try to do today, noting not only that it's the internet that attracts punditry, but so too does childhood. And ideas about childhood, even those expressed in academic contexts, are intensely framed by our hopes and anxieties regarding social and technological change. So these moral ideas and fears have also, of course, framed policy deliberations, and these have been difficult over the last 10 years. Perhaps we've got to a better place. I don't know. Initially, discussions of risk and safety took place in completely different places, completely different conferences or events from discussions of educational and other benefits. The two conversations ran in parallel, each ignorant of the other. The example I like best was Tony Blair promising to post all children's emails on their school websites in a spirit of participation, only quickly to realise that this was a bit of a risk. For a long time, too few adults have known very much about the internet by comparison with the children, so we've had a kind of digital native rhetoric, now roundly critiqued. But I think that has in a way undermined the confidence of parents and teachers to manage this medium. We've had opinions from libertarians and from the moral majority, one fearing government intervention, the other calling for Canute-like control, and neither, it sometimes seems to those of us in the research domain, welcoming a nuanced, context-dependent account of how internet use is becoming variously embedded in children's lives. And two metaphors have dominated both problematic. One was that of the virtual or cyber, kind of unreal realm floating in the ether where nothing really seemed to matter. The second metaphor was that of the Wild West, a vision of the internet where the natural wilderness impedes society's efforts to regulate and moreover should elude such efforts, as only thus can innovation flourish. When Tessa Jowell, then Secretary of State for Media in Britain, said in 2002, "We do not intend to regulate the internet," she pleased many in the industry, the free marketeers, those fighting for adult civil liberties, and many of those advocating children's communication rights. And yet, as my colleague Damien Tambini observed, citing Lessig's code and other laws of cyberspace, of course the internet has always been regulated. And the question is not whether, but how, for what reasons, and my question, with what justification from the evidence base. So as I said, in recent years there's been an explosion of research, and to see where we've reached, I want to critically examine the risks associated with children's use of the internet. And I shall start neither with children nor with the internet, but with the concept of risk. Despite its frequent use in everyday language, the notion of risk is hugely disputed and difficult to define. So as not to get diverted, I'll just point here to a key distinction in the research literature that I think is often missed in policy discussions, that between a psychological or scientific approach and that of a cultural or critical approach. So to start with the classic account of risk, the scientific account, in the psychology of risk, Glynis-Breakwell centres the classic account on two core assertions. One concerns the effects of particular hazards, which are prototypically, though not necessarily natural occurrences, that carry a risk of harm. The other is the probability that the hazard will produce the effect, since risks describe probabilities, not certainties. Given that harms, preferably recognised as unambiguously bad outcomes, are to be prevented if possible, calculating the probability that the hazard will result in harm has generated many efforts to identify the factors that shape this causal relationship. So here's a kind of a classic approach. What do we have? We have three tasks. The first is the researcher's task, that of risk assessment. The second is the risk evaluation task, down to both the public and policymakers. The third, the task of risk management. That's the task of many bodies, institutional and policymakers. I think this helps already what is a sometimes confused discourse of child online safety. Being exposed to pornography online, we may say, is a risk in the sense that it's associated with a certain probability and degree of harm. And so it's important that the evidence base measures these. However, the identification of online risk does not imply that harm will inevitably follow, nor that all users will be equally affected. Every time I report that children encounter pornography on the internet, I have to say that sentence again. The identification of online risk does not imply that harm will inevitably follow, and nor that all users will be equally affected. Rather, the approach invites consideration of the multiple factors that intervene between the hazard and the harm, all of which could in principle be researched and calculated so that in any circumstance we can judge the probability, we can judge the risk. And usually to do that we have to take into account the particular and contingent interaction between user and environment. So note then that the terms hazard and harm refer to the world, but risk refers to a calculation made by the observer. So following Klinker and Wren, the risk should be dealt with by conducting a risk evaluation, which establishes the legitimacy of risk management, such as the development of regulatory institutions or user tools and tactics. At times, of course, policymakers might decide, notwithstanding the risk assessment, to tolerate some risks to children rather than implement a strategy to reduce them, because the costs of intervention might be too high for the child by restricting their freedoms, or might be too high for the industry by introducing too much regulation, or might be too high for the state, with too heavy a burden of implementation and compliance. So research findings inform but do not determine policy. A couple of years ago, based on our review of around 400 studies then conducted across Europe, the EU Kids Online Network classified online risks to children in terms of the array of concerns expressed in the public debates. Sexual, aggressive, value-related and commercial risks were all widely discussed. Just to give one example, when the Pew Internet Foundation reported in 2009 that 15% of American 12 to 17-year-olds with a mobile phone had received sexually suggestive nude or nearly nude images of someone they know, sexting quickly became the latest risk on the policy agenda, with stakeholders, especially law enforcement and educators, springing into action. So the classic approach to risk gives us a way forward, requiring us to ask, is sexting harmful? If so, which teenagers are vulnerable? And what factors affect sexting? Sorry, sexting here has got scare quotes. Especially, is it something about the mobile or the internet that makes matters worse? Not asking these questions, and the media generally does not ask them, can imply that all children are at risk, just as are children who face such natural hazards as volcanoes or earthquakes. And this fuels those anxious calls to restrict children's access, increase surveillance, or legislate against online freedoms. But this analysis has its limits, and treating the internet as a natural hazard in children's lives is unsatisfactory. In fact, this analysis no longer works for volcanoes and earthquakes either. Neither offline nor online do people live in an equivalent of the old Wild West. We've redesigned the conditions of modern life in the light of our knowledge of the world, and so we need the critical cultural approach also. I'll take Ulrich Beck as my prototype case of this. Beck, social theorist of the risk society, argues, as you see, that risk may be defined as a systematic way of dealing with the hazards and insecurities induced and introduced by modernisation itself. Until the modern era, he argues, societies were preoccupied with natural hazards, flooding, volcanoes, plagues, and so on. Since these are uncontrollable in themselves, people only seek to manoeuvre around them. But today, societies are preoccupied with risks of our own making, being, quote, no longer concerned exclusively with making nature useful or with releasing mankind from traditional constraints, but also and essentially with problems resulting from techno-economic development itself. Questions of the development and deployment of technologies are being eclipsed by questions of the political and economic management of the risks of actually or potentially utilised technologies. So risk, he says, stems from the conditions of modern life rather than from outside them. And society's task is less to respond to the inevitable, unpredictable hazards, but rather to act so as to manage risks by anticipating possible harms. So in dealing with the problem of online grooming or bullying, we can not only respond when a child is distressed, but we can also anticipate the risk by preparing the child, by the way we design the online environment, by how we constrain possible perpetrators, and so on. Following Tony Giddens, in today's reflexive modernity, we cannot act as if ignorant of the evidence of previous occurrences, nor of the possible, if unintended, consequences of institutional actions. For example, now to design a social networking site for small children without anticipating how it might be abused by ill-intentioned adults would be naive. We have to use the knowledge we have, including, in this instance, the evidence that to the extent that adults threaten kids, they're more likely to be a friend's dad than a complete stranger. So special sites for kids and their parents may make matters worse, not better. So this is where a multi-stakeholder policy comes in, as often and usefully illustrated by the road safety analogy, a better analogy than that of the Wild West, or indeed the image of the weird world of the virtual. And I like it because nobody seems to think that road safety for kids restricts adults' freedoms unreasonably. So let's consider the road safety analogy. Among those children who ride a bicycle, a small percentage will have an accident. The risk of harm is calculable, a function of the probability of the accident and its severity. Protective factors reduce the risk, including environmental factors like cycle paths and careful drivers and a nearby park, and they include individual factors. The child has received road safety training or has good coordination. Risk factors increase the likelihood of harm and or its severity, and these too may be environmental factors, ill-regulated roads, careless drivers, long distances to travel, or they may be individual factors, lack of road sense, insufficient parental supervision. For policymakers, this analysis spreads the responsibility and opens up multiple points of intervention. Moreover, it overcomes the limitation of the classic approach to risk assessment, evaluation and management, namely that doesn't take into account the benefits of cycling or internet use. And so it may find appealing the simple solution of banning children from cycling or internet use. In the complex world we have created for ourselves, as Beck argues, risks and opportunities are not opposed, but instead they tend to go hand in hand. The more of one, the more of the other, as Ellen Helsborough and I showed empirically in the UK Children Go Online project. Why? Because to post content online, you must provide your personal details. To make new friends, you must contact strangers. To explore diverse information may expose you to inappropriate content. In other words, the very same act, like making a new contact, can be an opportunity, more friends, or increase the risk of harm, meeting an abusive stranger. And since even pornography or race hate can provide valuable lessons for inquisitive children, the policymaker's task of maximising opportunities and minimising risks is not easy. So rather than making generalised assumptions about what's good or bad for children, the evidence needed for policymaking should instead examine the myriad ways in which children, themselves a diverse group, interact with the online environment, also diverse, in any effort to trace either beneficial and/or harmful consequences for children. Offline, this is exactly what evidence is used for. The nature of town planning, transport regulation, the various roles of state, firms, communities and individuals is a hugely complex and reflexive enterprise, building on decades of evidence, experimentation, evaluation of initiatives and evolved norms. We're nowhere near this sophistication in relation to the online world. Instead, research gets claimed in support of one grand position or another, divorced from the other studies that contextualise and counterbalance it as part of a critical analysis. So we get this. It's funny what Googling children and the internet gives you, but I'm particularly like that one. So how does the road safety analogy help us consider the child who goes to an offline meeting with someone they first met online? As with cycling, this activity carries a risk of harm, but that risk may be small, and the same activity may also bring benefits in terms of new friends and interests. Society neither prevents children from crossing the road nor permits them to run freely across the motorway. Rather, it takes the concerted actions of parents, teachers, car designers, road authorities and town planners to enable an acceptable balance to be struck between opportunities and risks. Online, unless children are to live in heavily filtered environments with Facebook and YouTube banned and adults always peering over their shoulders, a better resolution than a simple trade-off of opportunities and risks must be found. Such efforts are underway, drawing in many stakeholders to develop forms of self and co-regulation, practices of parental and school mediation, and an array of proactive and reactive technical tools, all in the hope of reducing risks without also reducing opportunities. Still, in a small minority of cases, such meetings will result in harm, and the severity of this will range from mildly upsetting to criminal abuse. So here we have a further problem, one that's exacerbated by a reflexive approach to risk, but acknowledges society's role in risk creation, namely public opinion's struggle when it comes to children to accept any degree of risk above zero. Shaped by the media's tendency to amplify the threat to the innocence of children, or to a risk-free childhood, risk anxiety has become a constant and pervasive feature of everyday consciousness, especially for parents. And this too is a harm that must be weighed in the task of risk evaluation and management. Why should we permit any degree of risk? Why is a world without risk undesirable? Not only because risks and opportunities go hand in hand, but also because children learn through risk. Developmental psychologists are clear that encountering risks, even taking them deliberately, and crucially coping with risks, is all vital if children are to become resilient, for resilience develops through exposure to risk and stress. As one author defines it, resilience is a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. So a risk-averse society paradoxically exacerbates rather than reduces the very vulnerabilities it seeks to protect by undermining the development of resilience. Deborah Lupton adds that risk-averse discourses generate their own counter-discourses. Risk-taking, she says, may be regarded as the flip side of modernity, a response to the ever-intensifying focus on control and predictability of modernity. And certainly this is evident among teenagers who are, as another author put it, constantly engaged in risk assessment, actively creating and defining the hierarchies premised on different discourses of risk as what's normal or acceptable or dangerous and out of control. They deliberately engage in what Andrew Hope has called boundary performances, transgressing adult norms. And one would misunderstand adolescence to suppose that once teenagers are made aware of the risks, they will cease to take them. So what risks are we talking about? Recall that in classifying the risks to children on the internet, the EU Kids Online network considered risks of social concern, including aggressive, sexual, value-related and commercial risks. We not only identified these, as it were, as possible hazards, but following Ulrich Beck, we position them in relation to the knowing actions of both child and environment, especially the online environment. So we distinguish content risks, which position the child as a recipient, generally of mass-produced content. They're increasingly of user-generated content. Contact risks, in which someone contacts the child, requiring him or her to participate in some way, if unwittingly or unwillingly. And conduct risks, where the child is an actor, generally as part of a peer-to-peer or networked interaction. So following our survey, which is in the report, which was a survey of 1,000 children in each of 25 countries, so 25,000 children in all, aged between 9 and 16, our findings, very briefly, are as follows. Horrible synthesis. This was percentage of children who use the internet who said that, as we variously, complexly phrased it in the survey, they had encountered these risks. We didn't ask about everything. This is victim and perpetrator. You might raise questions about the figures later, but I want to move on. And I want to observe that we've put up this table, not necessarily with the percentages, for several years, and very rarely has anyone asked us what are the harms that these risks refer to. For certain risks, the connection with harm might seem fairly self-evident. If you receive hostile or nasty messages from peers repeated over time, perhaps. The harm associated with exposure to online pornography, violence, or race hate is harder to reach agreement on, as are the harms linked to participating in user-generated discussions about anorexia or sending a romantic partner a sexual image of yourself. Why are the harms so hard to determine? Paralleling the classification of risk, can we propose a classification of harm? Might we agree on a classification of harm? We might distinguish physical harm, emotional harm, feeling upset or threatened, psychological harm, low self-esteem, disturbed sexual development, aggressiveness, social harm, loss of friends, being ostracized. Each of these four aspects of well-being, the physical, emotional, psychological, social, can be undermined as a consequence of online risk. A second dimension might be severity, the degree of damage, how long it lasts. The task of definition is not so difficult. Mapping the risks onto the harms will take some thinking through, as will getting the evidence. But these tasks, I think, are our crucial next steps. In the case of road accidents, the risk to the child is defined as the probability of the accident times the severity of the consequences, whether it's merely bruised or whether the child has been killed. The nature of the harm is not so difficult to determine. So the risk is calculated by dividing the number of children hurt in various ways on the road by the number of children in the population. Risk, harm, and the relation between them are as clear as the measurement of those numbers is accurate. But on the internet, we do not know how many children come to harm, and we don't have the equivalent of the road accident statistics. Such objective evidence of harm might have been expected from law enforcement, clinicians, or child welfare services, for example, in cases where the internet is involved in incidents of sexual abuse or criminal abduction, youth suicide, or self-harm, but little such evidence has been forthcoming, partly because the involvement of the internet is not reliably recorded in police or clinical records. So we know more about how many children go to an offline meeting with an online contact than we know for how many this resulted in abuse. It's the opposite of the situation for road accidents. Where we do have figures, for example for youth suicide, we don't know the proportion of cases in which the internet played a role. Indeed, 10 years after the advent of mass internet, researchers and policymakers are still forced to rely on incidents learned of ad hoc from the media, often, and we cannot gauge what proportion of the population they represent. So this is where the road safety analogy breaks down. For researchers survey the children who are online, ask how many encountered the risk, the event or activity which carries a probability of harm, and we divide the latter by the former. So what we report, therefore, is not the real risk, in other words, not the probability of actual harm in the child population, but we report the risk of the risk, the probability of seeing pornography, or the probability of receiving hostile messages or visiting a self-harm chat room. And meanwhile, the probability that this in turn will result in harm remains elusive. It's like reporting the risk of road accidents in terms of the risk of children crossing the road, rather than the risk of them being hurt. The best we can do, and it's not bad, is to ask the child, have you been hurt? In relying on subjective methods, asking children not only whether they've encountered pornography or hostile messages, for example, but also whether it upset or bothered or distressed them, we can get some information. Of course, it's even more subjective than asking them whether the event or the behaviour happened in the first place, and possibly the risk figures might be seen as a better proxy for harm than asking children about harm directly. Still, inviting children to speak for themselves rather than always speaking for them is an effort worth making. And this was the next step in the EU Kids Online survey. My colleagues who know what went into making these numbers are probably horrified at this reduction. Of children who said they had been in some ways bullied on the internet, 4 in 5 said this upset them. Of children who'd received a sexual message, 1 in 4 said this upset them. Of children who met a stranger, met offline a person they first met online, 1 in 9 said this upset them. So what do we see? Some children do experience harmful consequences from risky online experiences, but most do not. Overall, about 4 in 10 of the children we surveyed had experienced one or more kinds of risk, but only about 1 in 8 of all children had felt bothered or upset by an online experience. Of course, there's much we can't ask for ethical reasons. There are difficulties in establishing what children mean by being upset, and these results may not satisfy the skeptics who ask whether a child will tell the truth or whether they're even in a position to judge the severity of what has happened to them. So given these qualifications and complexities, some will still dismiss further consideration of the internet as affording children harm, and they'll dismiss the policy efforts to reduce such harm. Others will take a strong position, asserting that all risk results in harm. For example, a child who sees pornography or learns of the existence of pro-anorexia sites is in some way harmed merely by the fact of the event. And university research ethics committees are inclined to take exactly that view. A weaker position might assert that certain risks self-evidently result in harm, for example, a 6-year-old exposed to hardcore pornography, but others are more debatable. Whether a strong or a weak position is taken, the precautionary principle, of course, is invoked to call for policy action in the absence of research evidence. I want to get one step closer to the crucial relation between risk and harm before drawing to a close. Let's pursue that example, that something needs to be done about the possibility of a 6-year-old being exposed to hardcore pornography online. There is little or no evidence of 6-year-olds being damaged by such exposure, nor can we set out to obtain such evidence, so why are we concerned? Because, I suggest, first, something is being implied about the child. A 6-year-old is vulnerable, while an older child is more digitally literate or resilient. And second, something is being implied about the internet. The internet makes pornography, and extreme pornography, more readily available than any previous medium. So policy interventions are legitimate or not according to what we know of users' vulnerability and what we know of the internet's affordances. Offline, in the rest of the world, the protective and risk factors, both individual and environmental, that mediate between childhood risk and harm have been well studied, and the result is a recognition of the complexity of the problem. We should expect no simple answers for online risk either. But to pursue these issues, in the EU Kids Online project, we're exploring a number of hypotheses, and I shall illustrate them in relation to our more recent problem of sexting. Or, as we actually measured it, as we actually studied it, children who have received a sexually explicit message on the internet. which may or may not be what they're talking about here. Receiving sexual messages is a typical case of ambiguous risk and uncertain harm. It could be innocent fun, or it could be flirtatious or part of an intimate relationship. But it could be a form of sexual harassment or even part of a process of grooming. As with the Pew Internet survey, in the EU Kids Online survey, we found a similar number, 1 in 7, 11 to 16-year-olds in Europe who said they'd received such a message, and this depended heavily on their age. So what does it tell us, and how should it inform policy? Well, we began with a theory, which I'm not going to go all the way through here, but was our attempt to put the key factors that we've measured in the survey onto at least one page, and imagine that at the level of the individual user, demographic and psychological factors shape use, what activities children do online, the risk factors that then lead to either harm or coping, and we want to leave both possibilities open. We then imagine at the social level that this will be mediated by the activities of children, school and peers, and at the cultural level that this will be mediated by various structural, regulatory and cultural factors. Then in our research we're just completing now, we've tested 3 hypotheses. So the usage hypothesis suggests that as children get older, they encounter more risks on the internet, partly because they do more on the internet. They have more activities of use. This relationship, as we hypothesize it, between use and risk, as a mediator of age and risk, may simply reflect older children's greater access to the internet, or, given the disinhibiting nature of much online communication, it may also be that older children on the internet undertake more risky practices. These risky online practices may also be explained by their personalities, for example, by being more sensation-seeking. So we can trace various lines there. The risk migration hypothesis is built on the recognition that children encounter a range of risks in their everyday lives, either because some are more at risk, a matter of relative disadvantage, or because of adolescents' tendency to take risks in order to test themselves against the world and develop resilience. So the idea of risk migration is that since the virtual real boundary is not so significant to that so-called digital generation, risk experiences that occur offline will also now occur online. Moreover, not all children encounter offline risks equally. It might be a matter of age or other factors. So just focusing in on the individual user, this was the part that we were now testing, and here is the usage hypothesis, the way in which children, depending on their demographics and the psychological factors, use the internet may affect the likelihood that they have received a sexual message on the internet, and the hypothesis was confirmed. Children who use the internet more, who did more on the internet, and who particularly did a range of risky online things like having their profiles on public, or setting or adding people to their contacts that they didn't know face to face, or seeking out new friends on the internet, were all more likely to receive sexual messages, and this mediated the relationship between their age and the risk. The second hypothesis was also confirmed, the risk migration hypothesis. So older children were more likely to receive sexual messages. Children who were more sensation-seeking, as part of their personality, were more likely to receive sexual messages. And this was significantly mediated by the risk behaviour offline. We asked 11 to 16-year-olds, have you got drunk? Are you in trouble with the police? Do you skip school? Have you had sex? Something else that I've forgotten. Do you take drugs? So offline risk behaviour also explained online risk behaviour. But we haven't really got from sexting to harm, except we assume that you have to go through sexting to be harmed by it, logically. And indeed, the factors that shape risk encounters may not be the same as the factors that shape the probability of harm. So since we've already seen that only a minority of those who encounter a risk say that they are harmed by it, we then examined what we'll call the vulnerability hypothesis, namely that those children who encounter risk online, among those children who encounter the risk, harm is more likely to result the more the child is vulnerable due to psychological and demographic factors. My skills with PowerPoint are limited. You have to forgive me. So this was also confirmed. As predicted, younger children and also girls were more upset by receiving sexual messages, but the effects of these variables were supplemented by them being less sensation-seeking, less confident, and having more psychological issues to do with their emotions, their friends, their conduct. Indeed, the strongest effect on harm was the measure of the psychological difficulties that the children experienced, with children higher on that score more likely to find sexual messaging upsetting than those with lower scores. The sensation-seeking variable was interesting. Children with higher scores on sensation-seeking were more likely to receive sexual messages. They were the ones who go out and take risks. But the children who were lower on sensation-seeking were more likely to be harmed by it. Perhaps they have tested themselves less and formed less resilience. Footnote for John, it says here, these findings are statistically significant, but they don't account for a huge amount of the variance. In other words, these are some of the factors that matter in explaining online risk and harm, including that children who are vulnerable offline may also be vulnerable online. But that's not all that's going on. And there are many children in our survey who reported receiving a sexual message and being upset by it, and we don't know why. You may be relieved that I've reached my conclusions. So there's lots more findings in the report, and we are listening very carefully to how everyone responds to the research and deciding what analyses now to conduct with this rather extraordinarily large and complicated data set that we have generated. Where have I got to today? In terms of the analysis of risk and harm, I've argued that it's useful to distinguish between risk, a calculation based on probability and likely consequences, and harm, a distinct outcome, whether we measure it objectively, if only we could, or subjectively. The field of children's online risk faces particular problems in measuring harm, and therefore it also struggles to measure risk, more often measuring the risk of the risk, the nature and likelihood of risky experiences that bear a still unclear relation to harm. On the assumption, not too naive I hope, that evidence will increasingly be forthcoming, we will find ourselves in the coming years tracking the risk factors and the protective factors that shape children's online experiences and their consequences. Since risk and harm can be distinguished, different explanations for each may apply, as I've illustrated with receiving sexual messages. We have been pursuing the individual risk and protective factors that apply in the life of the child, but of course we also need research on the environmental factors to do with the internet, who does what there, how is that environment designed and managed. In our findings and in the wider literature, there's increasing evidence that children who are at risk or vulnerable offline are also vulnerable online, and how children use the internet also matters. Others are producing evidence on the nature of the online environment and how that ameliorates or exacerbates the experience of harm, and I think we're still working out what makes the difference. This is not to say that the internet is necessarily risky or intrinsically bad, but that everything depends on the interaction between users and that complex social technological environment and how that interaction is shaped. The task of responding to the assessment of risk by first evaluating acceptable levels of risk and then developing policies to manage risk is impeded by a public reluctance to accept any risk to children, notwithstanding public disquiet over a risk-averse culture of childhood, and it's impeded by the inability of traditional risk calculations to take into account the benefits of internet use in general and of learning to cope with tolerable levels of online risk in particular. So these are some of the complexities regarding online risk and harm in childhood. While researchers get on with addressing these and related issues and building up as rigorous an evidence base for the online domain as already exists for the offline domain, I've also argued that policymakers should seek to manage online risk in ways that neither increase children's digital exclusion nor leave them vulnerable to harm. And that means taking action both to improve the design of the online environment and to enhance children's resilience. I would like finally to thank my network, who are all pictured there, and to thank you for listening.